Right now, more than 8 billion people call Earth home. We're scattered across every corner of the planet, packed into bustling cities, working on sprawling farms, living in remote mountain villages, even surviving in harsh deserts. We've constructed towering skyscrapers that pierce the clouds, launched rockets toward Mars, and woven an invisible web called the Internet that connects us all. No other species has ever controlled this planet the way we do. But here's something that'll stop you in your tracks. Rewind 900,000 years. If you could look at Earth back then, you'd see a completely different story. Humanity wasn't thriving. We weren't dominating anything. In fact, we were barely surviving. Scientists now estimate that only about 1,180 humans remained alive across the entire planet. Let that sink in. Not over 1 million. Not even 100,000. Just 1 to 280 breeding individuals. That's roughly the population of a small town today. The entire future of our species, everyone who would ever exist, was balanced on a razor's edge so fragile, it's a miracle we're here at all. Imagine that moment when you slam on your brakes and narrowly avoid crashing into another car. Your heart races. You think about how close you came to disaster. That's what happened to humanity, except it wasn't just one terrifying moment. It stretched across 117,000 years of clinging to survival by our fingernails. And the wildest part? We didn't discover this until 2023. The clues were always there for decades. Scientists suspected something dramatic happened in our ancient past. The evidence was hiding in plain sight, inside our DNA. Here's the thing. Humans have strangely low genetic diversity compared to other animals. Take chimpanzees, for example. They live in relatively small, isolated groups scattered throughout Africa. Yet they have far more genetic variation than all 8 billion humans combined. That's bizarre. That's not how populations normally work. It's the telltale sign of what scientists call a bottleneck, a moment when a species gets squeezed down to dangerously low numbers. But until recently, nobody understood just how severe that bottleneck actually was. Nobody realized humanity had teetered on the brink of total extinction. The discovery that changed everything. The breakthrough came from a researcher named Alice Roy at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. About 5 years ago, he was analyzing genetic data from modern humans, trying to piece together our evolutionary timeline. Pretty routine work, comparing DNA samples from over 3,000 people worldwide, tracking mutations backwards like rewinding a biological clock. Then something strange appeared in the numbers. Around 900,000 years ago, the genetic signals suddenly collapsed. Picture watching a crowded movie theater and, without warning, 99% of the audience just vanishes. The mathematical models were screaming that something catastrophic had occurred, but the numbers seemed too extreme to be real. At first, Roy thought he'd made a mistake, maybe a software glitch or a calculation error. Because if these results were accurate, it meant our ancestors had been reduced to a population smaller than most high schools. He couldn't accept it, not yet, so he checked again. And again. He ran different analyses, used alternative methods, brought in other researchers. Every single time, the same answer came back. Around 930,000 years ago, roughly 98, 7% of human ancestors were wiped out. And the survivors? They remained at critically dangerous population levels for more than 100,000 years. To put that in perspective, that's longer than modern humans have even existed as a species. Why this should have been the end. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so our ancestors had a rough patch. They got through it. What's the big deal? Here's the big deal. When populations shrink this severely, they almost never recover. They go extinct. Once you drop below around 1,000 individuals, biologists say you've entered the extinction vortex. It's a death spiral. Genetic problems start piling up. Inbreeding becomes unavoidable. A single drought, disease outbreak, or harsh winter can wipe out everyone who's left. Most species that hit these numbers simply disappear forever. They become fossils, cautionary tales in the geological record. But somehow, Against all odds, our ancestors didn't disappear. For 117,000 years, through freezing ice ages, devastating droughts, and the extinction of countless other species, this tiny group of early humans held on. Somewhere in Africa, scattered across who knows what kind of landscape, they kept the spark of humanity burning when it should have flickered out for good. The climate crisis that nearly ended us. What makes this discovery even more remarkable is when it happened. 900,000 years ago falls right in the middle of what geologists call the early Middle Pleistocene transition. This was the moment Earth's climate went completely haywire. Before this shift, ice ages followed a somewhat predictable pattern, cycling roughly every 41,000 years. The planet would cool down, ice sheets would expand, then things would warm back up. Challenging for sure, but at least it had a rhythm. Then, around 900,000 years ago, everything changed. The Ice Age cycle stretched out to brutal 100,000-year patterns. Glaciers grew massive, burying enormous sections of the northern continents under ice. Sea levels plunged by hundreds of feet. Ocean temperatures dropped dramatically. And in Africa, where our ancestors were struggling to survive, the climate became incredibly harsh and dry. Imagine living through this transformation. You're an early human, maybe Homo erectus or one of their descendants. The lush woodlands your grandparents knew are slowly vanishing. Generation after generation, your world becomes more barren, more desperate. Water sources dry up. The animals you depend on for food go extinct. Edible plants become harder and harder to find. And unlike modern disasters, this doesn't get better after a few years. It gets worse, for thousands upon thousands of years. This is what scientists call a perfect storm for mass extinction. And that's exactly what happened. Most human populations were completely wiped out. Only a tiny group, somewhere in Africa, managed to survive. We don't know exactly where. We don't know precisely how, but they did. The genetic signature written in our cells. Here's where the story takes an even more fascinating turn. During this bottleneck period, something extraordinary happened to human genetics, something that's never been reversed. Two of our ancestral chromosomes fused together. They literally merged into a single chromosome. This is why humans have 46 chromosomes, while our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, have 48. Chromosome fusion is incredibly rare. It might happen once across millions of years of evolution, and it occurred right in the middle of humanity's closest brush with extinction. That's not a coincidence. When populations are extremely small, unusual genetic changes can spread much faster than normal. If just one individual carried this chromosome fusion and managed to survive and have children, those children would inherit it. In a population of only 1,280 people, spread across a harsh landscape, a genetic change like this could become universal within just a few generations. Today, every single human on Earth carries this fused chromosome, all 8 billion of us. It's labeled chromosome 2, and deep within its structure lies the genetic memory of those desperate 117,000 years when humanity nearly vanished forever. The thread that connects us all. Think about that the next time you look at a crowd. Every person you see, every stranger on the street, every face on your screen is descended from that impossibly small group of survivors. We all share the same genetic bottleneck, the same fused chromosome, the same ancestors who refused to give up when every biological rule said they should. We're all here because they held on. Against a climate that tried to crush them, against odds that should have erased them from history. Through more than 1,000 centuries of survival on the edge of oblivion, humanity's story isn't just about dominance and achievement, it's also a story of fragility, luck, and endurance beyond imagination. We came terrifyingly close to never existing at all, but we made it. And now you know why that's nothing short of miraculous. The molecular evidence left behind. Scientists can actually pinpoint the exact location where this fusion occurred. Using advanced genetic tools, they've identified the molecular markers. the biological scars, where two separate chromosomes joined together millions of years ago. It's like examining forensic evidence from the most critical moment in human history. But this chromosome fusion did far more than just change our chromosome count. Some researchers believe it may have sparked changes in how our brains developed. Genes located near the fusion site influence neural function and brain structure. It's entirely possible that this genetic reshuffling during the bottleneck period helped drive the evolution of our larger, more sophisticated brains. Let that thought settle for a moment. Our intelligence, our ability to create art, compose music, build technology, our capacity for language, for abstract thinking, for imagining worlds that don't exist yet. All of it might trace back to a genetic accident that happened when fewer than 1,000 humans remained on Earth. That's either the most incredible coincidence in history, or evidence that even our darkest moments can become turning points towards something extraordinary. Reading the time capsule in our DNA. The proof of this bottleneck is permanently encoded in our DNA, like a biological time capsule that every human carries. Today's population geneticists can see it clearly in the patterns of genetic variation, the unmistakable mathematical fingerprint of near extinction. But for decades, they struggled to interpret what they were seeing. Here's why. Older genetic analysis methods were like trying to read an entire book through a keyhole. Scientists could detect that something significant had happened in humanity's past, but they couldn't make out the full story. They knew humans had experienced at least one major population crash, likely when our ancestors migrated out of Africa roughly 60,000 years ago. But they had absolutely no idea there was an earlier bottleneck that was far, far worse. Everything changed with the development of new computational tools, advanced methods that can simultaneously analyze thousands of genomes and trace genetic changes back nearly 1 million years. When researchers first published their findings in the journal Science in 2023, the scientific community was absolutely stunned, not just because the bottleneck was so severe, but because of how incredibly long it lasted, 117,000 years on the edge. Most population bottlenecks in evolutionary history are relatively brief events. A massive volcanic eruption wipes out most of a species. Then the survivors rapidly multiply to fill the empty ecological space. Or a devastating disease kills 90% of a population, but the remaining 10% bounce back within a few generations. But 117,000 years? That's not just a bottleneck. That's an extended near-death experience for an entire species, lasting longer than modern humans have even walked the Earth. Nick Ashton, an archaeologist at the British Museum who reviewed the study, captured it perfectly. This would suggest the surviving population occupied a very specific area with strong social bonds to make it through. Even more surprising is how long this tiny group managed to survive. If these findings are accurate, you'd need a stable environment with sufficient resources and minimal disruptions to sustain such a small population for that long. In other words, somewhere in Africa there existed a pocket of stability, a refuge where a small band of early humans found everything they needed to survive, while the rest of the continent was being torn apart by catastrophic climate change. But where was this sanctuary? What made it special? How did roughly 1,280 people maintain a viable population for over 100,000 years without collapsing into extinction? These questions still keep scientists awake at night. The search for humanity's safe haven. Some researchers believe the survivors lived near reliable water sources, perhaps around the Great Lakes region of East Africa, or along rivers that continued flowing even when the climate became brutal. Water means animals come to drink. Animals mean food. Water plus food equals survival. It's simple math that makes the difference between extinction and endurance. Other scientists think the survivors had developed crucial technologies that other human populations lacked. Maybe they'd figured out how to control fire more effectively. And fire changes everything. It allows you to cook food, unlocking more nutrients and calories. It keeps dangerous predators at a safe distance. It extends your productive hours beyond sunset, giving you more time to work, plan, and build social bonds. Most importantly, it lets you survive in environments that would otherwise be deadly. Here's the fascinating part. Archaeological evidence shows a sudden increase in fire use by human populations around 800,000 years ago. This timing aligns almost perfectly with when the genetic bottleneck ended and human populations began expanding again. Coincidence? Most scientists don't think so. The fossil gap mystery. Solved. For years, anthropologists were baffled by what they called the fossil gap. Between roughly 950,000 and 650,000 years ago, human fossils from Africa and Europe are extremely rare, almost non-existent. For the longest time, researchers couldn't explain why the fossil record from this period was so empty. Now we know the answer. There simply weren't many humans around to leave fossils behind. With only about 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across vast territories, the odds of any of them dying under conditions that would preserve their bones for hundreds of thousands of years were astronomically low. It's like searching for a needle in a haystack, except there are barely any needles, and the haystack is the size of a continent. The few fossils we do have from this time frame are mostly from Europe and Asia, not Africa. This suggests they probably represent human populations that weren't directly affected by the most severe part of the bottleneck. Perhaps the catastrophic population crash primarily impacted certain groups of early humans, while others in different regions managed to hang on in slightly larger numbers. This makes sense when you consider Africa's geography. It's an enormous continent with incredibly diverse climates and ecosystems. While some regions became completely uninhabitable during this climate crisis, others might have remained relatively stable. Tiny pockets of survival in an otherwise harsh world. We all come from the same 1,280 people. But here's what the genetic evidence makes crystal clear. The ancestors of all modern humans, plus Neanderthals and Denisovans, went through this extreme bottleneck. We're all descendants of those 1,280 survivors who refused to give up during the worst climate disaster in human evolutionary history. Every single person alive today carries DNA from that tiny, resilient population. Scientists estimate that we lost approximately 65% of our total genetic diversity during this bottleneck. That's an absolutely staggering amount. For perspective, consider the famous founder effect when modern humans left Africa around 60,000 years ago. That event only reduced our genetic diversity by roughly 15%. This earlier bottleneck was more than 4 times more devastating. And this massive loss of genetic diversity? It has consequences we're still living with today. The price we still pay here is something that might surprise you. Humans are unusually vulnerable to certain diseases. Our immune systems are relatively weak compared to other primates. Genetic disorders that would be extremely rare in more diverse populations show up far more often in humans. It's a strange irony. Our weaknesses are actually proof of our greatest triumph. Every genetic vulnerability we carry today is living evidence that our ancestors were tough enough to survive when survival should have been impossible. Our biological fragility is the price tag for making it through the bottleneck. But here's the thing. The story doesn't end with just barely hanging on. The most incredible chapter was still to come. The Great Recovery begins. Around 813,000 years ago, something shifted. The population of early humans began growing again. Not slowly, not gradually, rapidly. Within just a few thousand years, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors had spread across Africa and pushed beyond its borders. They developed new technologies. They crafted more advanced tools. They hunted larger animals with greater efficiency. They constructed better shelters and mastered fire control more systematically. Most importantly, they embarked on an evolutionary journey that would eventually produce 3 of the most successful human species in history: modern humans, Neanderthals, and the mysterious Denisovans. The timing is too precise to be mere coincidence. Genetic evidence strongly suggests that the last common ancestor of all 3 species lived right around the time the bottleneck ended. It's as if the near-extinction event didn't just test our ancestors' survival abilities, it forged them into something entirely new, something stronger, something more adaptable, something that could not only survive in a hostile world, but eventually dominate it. Yi Xuan Pan, one of the scientists who uncovered this bottleneck, framed it perfectly. This discovery opens up a completely new field in human evolution. It raises so many questions. Where exactly did these survivors live? How did they overcome such catastrophic climate changes? And did natural selection during the bottleneck actually accelerate the evolution of the human brain? That last question is absolutely crucial. Natural selection during the bottleneck. Evolution in a pressure cooker. When populations are extremely small, evolution doesn't follow its normal rules. Usually, genetic changes spread slowly through large populations. Beneficial mutations take hundreds of generations to become widespread. Harmful ones take time to filter out. But in a population of just 1,280 individuals, evolution shifts into overdrive. Beneficial traits can sweep through the entire group within a handful of generations. Individuals with even slight advantages in survival or reproduction can rapidly dominate the gene pool. For 117,000 years, our ancestors were essentially living inside an evolutionary pressure cooker. Only the smartest, toughest, most adaptable individuals survived to pass along their genes. Generation after generation after generation of intense natural selection, selecting for exactly the traits that would later make humans extraordinarily successful. Problem-solving ability, social cooperation, advanced tool use, communication skills, the capacity to learn rapidly and adapt to changing environments. All of these defining human characteristics were likely being refined and amplified during those 117,000 years of dancing with extinction. The genetic bottleneck wasn't just something our ancestors survived. It was something that shaped them, and us, into who we are today. But what did that actually look like on the ground? What was it like living through 117,000 years of evolutionary hell? Let's take a journey back, living through the end of the world. It's 930,000 years ago, and the world is ending. Not in some dramatic explosion or asteroid strike. It's dying slowly, brutally, one failed harvest at a time. You're part of a small band of early humans, maybe 30 or 40 individuals total. Your species doesn't even have a formal name yet. Homo erectus? Homo heidelbergensis? Scientists still debate the specifics. What matters is this. You're human enough that your descendants, thousands upon thousands of generations later, will eventually become us. And right now, you're watching your entire world disappear. The forests where your parents hunted are transforming into scrubland. The scrubland is becoming desert. Rivers that flowed year-round are now seasonal streams, then just dry riverbeds marked by cracked, sun-baked mud. Your band moves constantly. You follow water sources that keep vanishing. You track animal herds that keep shrinking. You chase hope that keeps fading. This isn't a drought. Droughts eventually end. This is the new normal. When the Earth itself turned against us, Earth's orbital patterns have shifted into a nightmare configuration. Ice sheets in the far north are growing massive, locking up so much water that global sea levels drop by hundreds of feet. The Mediterranean Sea shrinks into a series of smaller lakes. Land bridges appear between continents that were once separated. But it's not the ice that's killing your people, it's what the ice does to Africa. When enormous ice sheets form in the northern hemisphere, they create what scientists call an atmospheric barrier. Weather patterns that once brought regular, life-giving rains to Africa get disrupted and redirected. The monsoons that fed the continent's great rivers become weak and unpredictable. What used to be lush woodland becomes grassland. Grassland becomes desert. And desert becomes nothing. Scientists have a technical term for what happened to Africa during this period: aridification. The continent didn't just get drier, it became catastrophically parched. Fossil evidence reveals that most large mammals went extinct. Antelope species that had thrived for millions of years simply vanished. Elephant populations crashed. When the big animals die out, everything else collapses with them. Predators starve, scavengers starve, and anything that depended on hunting or scavenging, like early humans, faces a brutal choice: adapt or die. Most chose poorly, or rather, most never got the chance to choose at all. The refuge. Nobody else found. But your small band, your scattered group of 1,280 individuals spread across the continent, you found something the others missed. Maybe it was a mountain range that still caught enough rainfall to support a few hardy trees. Maybe it was an underground aquifer that kept springs flowing when everything else dried to dust. Maybe it was a rift valley that created its own unique microclimate, a pocket of survival in a dying land. Whatever it was, it worked for 117,000 years. Now let's be clear about what working actually meant. Forget everything you think you know about human evolution being a steady march toward progress and advancement. There was no progress during the bottleneck. There was only survival. Your band probably lived in tight-knit groups of 20 to 30 people. Extended families where everyone was related to everyone else within just a few generations. You had to be. With only 1,080 breeding individuals, total scattered across vast distances, you couldn't afford to be choosy about partnerships. Inbreeding was inevitable. Genetic disorders were probably common. Birth defects, developmental problems, reduced fertility, all the painful consequences of a gene pool stretched dangerously thin. But somehow, against all biological odds, you persisted, the brutal rhythm of survival. The daily routine was unforgiving. Wake up, find water, find food, don't get killed. Repeat for 100,000 years. Water always came first. Always. In a landscape where most streams ran dry half the year, knowing where to find reliable water sources meant the difference between your family living or dying. Your people probably developed an almost supernatural ability to read the land, to spot subtle signs of underground water, to predict which seasonal streams would flow the longest, to remember every hidden spring across hundreds of miles. You might have learned to dig simple wells, crude ones, perhaps just holes scraped out with sticks and stones, but even a basic well that reached groundwater could sustain a family through the killing dry season. Food was even harder to secure when the big game disappeared. With most large game animals extinct, you couldn't rely on hunting the way your ancestors had. You became what anthropologists call dietary generalists, which is a polite way of saying you ate absolutely everything. Insects, always insects. Termites, crickets, beetle larvae. Pound for pound, insects are among the most nutritious food sources on the planet, and they reproduce quickly, so even small populations can be harvested without wiping them out completely. You ate roots and tubers, anything that grew underground where it was protected from the scorching heat and endless drought. You learned which plants were edible during different seasons, which ones were toxic unless prepared correctly, which ones could be dried and stored for the desperate times. You became an expert at finding eggs, bird eggs, reptile eggs, anything packed with protein. You probably learned to track certain animals to their nesting sites, timing your raids carefully to maximize what you could take without destroying future breeding. And occasionally, when fortune smiled on you, you found meat. Not the massive woolly mammoths your ancestors hunted in coordinated groups of dozens. Those giants were long gone. But smaller prey. A young antelope separated from its herd, an injured zebra, an old elephant dying of thirst by a dried-up waterhole. Fire. The difference between life and death. This is where fire became absolutely crucial. Early humans had been using fire for hundreds of thousands of years before the bottleneck. But during these desperate times, fire wasn't just useful or convenient. It was the difference between life and death. Cooking meat made it far safer to eat, killing parasites and bacteria that could wipe out your entire family in days. Even more importantly, cooking broke down tough proteins, and made nutrients more bioavailable. You could extract more calories and nutrition from the same amount of food. Cooking plants was even more revolutionary. The plant food revolution. Many roots and tubers are completely indigestible when eaten raw. Some are even poisonous. But cook them over a fire and they transform into major sources of carbohydrates, rich, calorie-dense fuel for hungry bodies. Some researchers believe this is precisely when humans first learned to systematically process plant foods, turning the inedible into the edible through heat and patience. But fire did far more than just improve nutrition. It extended your day. Without artificial light, most animals are completely helpless after dark. Predators prowl. Prey hides. Everyone basically shuts down until sunrise. But with fire, your band could remain active long after sunset. You could craft tools in the firelight, repair damaged shelters, share critical information about where you'd discovered water or tracked down food. And most importantly, you could strengthen social bonds. Why every single person mattered. Social bonds were absolutely everything during the bottleneck. With groups this small, you couldn't afford conflict. Every individual was precious. Lose one adult to fighting, accidents, or disease, and the entire band became weaker. Lose several people, and you might not make it through the next harsh season. So you developed cooperation skills that would put modern diplomats to shame. You learned to share resources even when resources were desperately scarce. You learned to resolve disputes without violence. You learned to care for the sick and injured instead of abandoning them to die alone. Most crucially, you learned to share knowledge. When one person discovered a new water source, everyone learned its location immediately. When someone figured out how to process a toxic plant to make it safe to eat, that knowledge spread through the group like wildfire. When hunters developed a better technique for tracking game, it became common practice within days. This wasn't just about being kind. This was survival strategy. In a population this tiny, losing accumulated knowledge when someone died could be absolutely catastrophic. So you developed oral traditions, teaching methods, systematic ways of passing vital information from one generation to the next. You became obsessive about teaching children, not just basic survival skills, but everything. Where to find water in each season, which plants were safe to eat, how to read animal tracks in the dirt, how to predict incoming weather patterns, how to make and maintain essential tools. Children who learned quickly had better chances of survival. Children who learned quickly had better chances of reproducing. Over thousands of generations, you were naturally selecting for intelligence, for teaching ability, for the capacity to acquire and transmit complex information. You were evolving into something new. Our brains start growing. Genetic evidence suggests that during the bottleneck, human brain size began to increase. Not dramatically, that explosive growth would come later, but measurably. The skull capacity of human fossils from just after the bottleneck period is noticeably larger than those from before it. This makes perfect sense. When survival depends on outsmarting your environment rather than overpowering it, natural selection favors bigger, more capable brains, even though larger brains require substantially more energy that was desperately scarce during the crisis. But it wasn't just raw intelligence that was evolving, it was specifically social intelligence. Living in tiny, tightly knit groups for thousands of generations, you became incredibly skilled at reading other people, at predicting their behavior, at knowing when to trust, when to be cautious, when to share, when to hold back. You developed what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have thoughts, feelings, and intentions different from your own. This sounds simple. It's not. It's actually one of the most complex cognitive abilities in the entire animal kingdom. And you were refining it under the most intense survival pressure imaginable. The archaeological clues. The archaeological record from this period is frustratingly sparse, which makes sense given how few people existed, but what little evidence we do have is absolutely fascinating. Tools become more sophisticated, but also more standardized. It's as if scattered groups were developing consistent methods for making things, then sharing those techniques widely across vast distances. Stone tools from the late bottleneck period show what archaeologists call cultural convergence. Similar designs appearing in different regions at roughly the same time. This suggests communication networks between groups, trade routes, maybe even regular gatherings where separate bands would meet to exchange not just goods, but knowledge and genes. Because here's something critical about those 1,280 breeding individuals. They weren't all living in one place. Scattered for survival. Basic population genetics tells us they had to be spread out across the landscape. Put 1,280 people in a single valley and one disaster, a flash flood, prolonged drought, disease outbreak, or volcanic eruption, could wipe them all out in one tragic blow. Evolution doesn't make that kind of mistake. So they were scattered, maybe groups of 20 or 30 people separated by hundreds of miles, connected through networks of kinship and trade, but living independently enough that no single catastrophe could destroy everyone. This created what biologists call a metapopulation structure. Individual groups would rise and fall, some going extinct, others thriving and sending out migrants to repopulate empty territories. It's like a desperate game of whack-a-mole, except the moles are human populations and the hammers are droughts, diseases, and climate disasters. Some groups get hit hard and disappear, but others survive, reproduce, and gradually repopulate the devastated areas. For 117,000 years, this desperate game continued. Some generations probably lived relatively well, finding decent territories with reliable resources. Others suffered terribly, watching children die of starvation, disease, and exposure. But somehow the network held. The world begins to heal. Then around 813,000 years ago, something changed. The first signs were subtle. Slightly more reliable rainfall in certain regions, grasslands beginning to expand again after thousands of years of desert, animal populations starting to slowly recover. The extreme phase of the climate crisis was finally ending, but by this time, your people weren't the same species that had entered the bottleneck all those millennia ago. 117,000 years of brutal natural selection had transformed them, made them smarter, more cooperative, better adapted to survive in the harshest environments Earth could throw at them. They had developed technologies that would have seemed like pure magic to their distant ancestors. Superior tools, more sophisticated fire management, advanced food processing techniques. Most importantly, they had developed social systems capable of maintaining cooperation and knowledge sharing across multiple generations. When the climate finally began to improve, they were ready. The Great Expansion population growth was explosive. Within just a few thousand years, which is basically a blink in evolutionary time, descendants of the bottleneck survivors had spread across Africa and begun pushing outward into Europe and Asia. They carried with them all the survival skills learned during the crisis, plus the genetic and cultural adaptations that had kept them alive when death seemed absolutely certain. These weren't just any humans. These were humans who had been forged in the fires of the worst environmental disaster in our species' history. They were the ancestors of every human who would come after. Every person alive today carries genes that survived 117,000 years of near extinction. Genes selected for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. We are all descendants of the survivors, all products of the bottleneck, all living proof that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, a few determined individuals can be tough enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again. But the story was just beginning. When one species became three, picture this moment clearly. Your ancestors have just survived the worst climate disaster in human history. For over 100,000 years, they've been living on the knife's edge of extinction. Tiny groups scattered across Africa, desperately clinging to whatever refuges they could find. Then the rains return. Not all at once, not everywhere, but slowly, year by year, decade by decade, the grasslands start coming back. Rivers that had been bone dry for millennia begin flowing again. Animals that had vanished from vast regions start reappearing in small tentative herds. And your people, your battle-hardened, climate-tested, evolutionarily refined people, they exploded across the landscape like nothing the world had ever seen. Within just a few thousand years, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors had multiplied into hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. They spread from whatever isolated corner of Africa had sheltered them during the crisis and began colonizing territories that had been empty wastelands for ages. But here's where the story takes a truly wild turn. The unexpected split. They weren't just expanding as one big unified human family. The genetic bottleneck had done something unprecedented to human evolution. It had set the stage for the most important speciation event in our entire lineage. Around 800,000 years ago, that single population of survivors began splitting into three distinct groups. Three separate evolutionary paths that would eventually become the three most successful human species in history: modern humans, Neanderthals, and the mysterious Denisovans. Now, normally, speciation takes an incredibly long time, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe even millions. Species diverge slowly, accumulating tiny differences generation after generation until they can no longer interbreed. But the bottleneck compressed and accelerated everything. Those 117,000 years of intense natural selection had created what you might call evolutionary spring-loading. When the population finally expanded, it didn't just grow, it erupted in multiple directions at once. Think of it like this. Imagine taking a massive river and forcing all that water through the narrowest possible channel for 100,000 years. The pressure builds and builds. Then suddenly you remove the constraint. The water doesn't just flow, it explodes in every direction, carving new channels, creating entirely new pathways. That's exactly what happened to human evolution after the bottleneck. Three paths diverge. The first group stayed in Africa. These would eventually become the ancestors of modern humans, Homo sapiens, but they weren't quite modern yet. They were still evolving, still refining all those survival skills that had carried them through the crisis. The second group moved north and west into Europe and Western Asia. These populations encountered a vastly different world than the one their ancestors had known. Colder, more seasonal. Filled with new challenges and new opportunities, they adapted fast. The birth of three new species. Within a few 100,000 years, they had developed everything they needed to thrive in Ice Age Europe. Robust, stocky builds to conserve heat. Enlarged nasal passages to warm freezing air before it reached their lungs. Specialized cold weather adaptations. They became the Neanderthals. The third group went east, spreading across Asia, and eventually reaching as far as Indonesia and New Guinea. We know less about them because they left far fewer fossils behind. But we know they existed, because their DNA still appears in modern populations across Asia and Oceania today. They were the Denisovans. All three groups carried the genetic signature of the bottleneck: the fused chromosome, the reduced genetic diversity, the neural adaptations that had been naturally selected during those brutal 117,000 years. But they also began developing their own unique traits. The African innovators, the African population that stayed behind, faced a recovering but still unpredictable environment. They needed to be adaptable, innovative, capable of exploiting a wide variety of resources. As the climate continued to swing wildly, natural selection favored intelligence, problem-solving ability, and the capacity to develop new technologies quickly when conditions shifted. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this population developed what we now recognize as the defining features of modern humans: larger brains relative to body size, more slender bone structure, and an enhanced capacity for symbolic thinking. Most importantly, they developed what anthropologists call behavioral modernity, the ability to create art, use symbols, and engage in abstract reasoning. The mental toolkit that would eventually allow them to dominate the entire planet. But that was still far in the future. For now, they were just one of three human species, all competing for resources in a world still recovering from the greatest climate disaster in human history. The Ice Age Masters, Neanderthals. The Neanderthals, meanwhile, were becoming something else entirely. Moving into Europe during the climate recovery period, they encountered environments that were still brutally cold and fiercely seasonal. Winters that could last 8 months, summers that were brief and completely unpredictable. They adapted by becoming incredibly physically powerful. Neanderthal skeletons show bone density and muscle mass that would make modern bodybuilders look scrawny. They developed massive nasal passages to warm and humidify the cold, dry air they constantly breathed. Their brains actually grew larger than those of modern humans, possibly an adaptation to handle the complex challenges of Ice Age survival. But their most impressive adaptation was cultural. Neanderthals became master hunters, not just opportunistic scavengers like many of their predecessors, but systematic, strategic predators capable of taking down massive Ice Age mammals, woolly mammoths, giant bison, cave bears. They developed sophisticated spear-throwing techniques. They learned to hunt in tightly coordinated groups, driving large animals into carefully planned kill zones. They figured out how to preserve meat through the long, dark winters, probably using natural refrigeration in caves and permafrost. Most remarkably, they developed the first systematic burial practices in human history. Neanderthal graves show evidence of intentional, careful placement, sometimes with grave goods placed alongside the bodies. This suggests they had developed symbolic thinking, the ability to conceive of death as something meaningful, something worthy of ritual and respect. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were creating culture. The mysterious Eastern travelers, Denisovans. The Denisovans were doing something similar across Asia, but we know much less about their specific adaptations. What we do know is that they were incredibly successful. Genetic analysis of modern Asian populations reveals Denisovan DNA from the Philippines all the way to Tibet, indicating they spread across an enormous range of vastly different environments. Some Denisovan populations adapted to extreme high altitudes, developing genetic variants that helped them process oxygen more efficiently in the thin air of the Himalayan plateau. These exact genetic variants show up in modern Tibetan populations today, evidence that ancient humans and Denisovans interbred, passing along survival genes that are still helping people live at extreme elevations thousands of years later. Other Denisovan groups seem to have been skilled seafarers. There's solid evidence they reached islands in Southeast Asia that would have required sophisticated boat building and navigation skills. This suggests they developed maritime technologies thousands of years before any other human species, still connected after all. But here's what's truly incredible about all three groups. They were still genetically connected. Despite spreading across 3 continents and adapting to radically different environments, they remained genetically close enough to interbreed when their territories overlapped. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred when our ancestors finally left Africa around 60,000 years ago. Denisovans interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans at various times and places. The genetic evidence shows multiple episodes of interbreeding stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. This tells us something profound about the bottleneck and its aftermath. Those 117,000 years of near extinction had created a kind of genetic unity among all human populations. Despite evolving along different paths for hundreds of thousands of years, we were all still fundamentally the same species, all still carrying the chromosomal fusion that marked us as bottleneck survivors, all still sharing the basic genetic toolkit that had been refined and tested during those desperate millennia. But each group was also developing its own specialized survival strategies. An explosion of innovation. The archaeological record from this period shows an explosion of technological innovation, not just among one group, but among all three. In Africa, stone tool technology becomes increasingly sophisticated. The simple choppers and hand axes that had dominated human toolkits for millions of years gradually give way to carefully crafted spear points, scrapers, and cutting implements designed for highly specific tasks. More importantly, toolmaking become standardized. Archaeological sites from across Africa show remarkably similar tool designs, suggesting widespread communication and knowledge sharing between distant groups. This is the unmistakable signature of true cultural evolution. Ideas spreading faster than genes, allowing rapid adaptation to new challenges and opportunities. In Europe, Neanderthals were developing their own technological traditions. They created the first hafted tools, spear points and knives carefully attached to wooden handles using plant resins and animal sinews. This might sound simple, but it represents a major cognitive leap. You have to plan ahead, gather multiple different materials, understand abstract concepts like torque and leverage. They also developed what archaeologists call prepared core techniques for stone tool making. Instead of just randomly chipping away at rocks until they got something useful, Neanderthals learned to carefully shape stone cores so they could produce multiple identical tools from a single piece of raw material. This is manufacturing planned, systematic production of standardized goods. Denisovan achievements. The Denisovans were innovating too, though their specific achievements are harder to trace archaeologically. But genetic analysis suggests they were the first human species to develop systematic use of plant medicines. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan gene variants that help process plant toxins, suggesting their ancestors had learned to use poisonous plants as medicines, developing biological resistance through generations of natural selection. They might also have been the first humans to practice systematic agriculture. Some researchers believe the genetic variants that help digest starchy foods in modern Asian populations originated with Denisovans, who had learned to cultivate and process wild grains. The social revolution. But perhaps the most important innovation was happening in the realm of social organization. All three post-bottleneck human species were developing increasingly complex social structures. Extended family groups were forming strategic alliances with other groups. Trade networks were emerging that could move raw materials and finished goods across hundreds of miles. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was the beginning of civilization. The genetic evidence for this social revolution is literally written in our DNA. During the post-bottleneck expansion, human populations show clear evidence of what geneticists call structured breeding patterns. Not random mating, but systematic exchange of marriage partners between groups. This strongly suggests our ancestors had developed kinship systems, specific rules about who could marry whom, probably elaborate gift exchange networks that maintained peaceful relationships between distant communities. They were creating the social glue that would eventually allow human societies to scale up from small bands to tribes, chiefdoms, and eventually complex states. But they were also creating something else, something that would prove even more important in the long run. Language, the mystery of language. Now, nobody knows exactly when human language evolved. It doesn't fossilize. We can only piece together its development from indirect clues scattered across time. But everything points to the post-bottleneck period as the era when human communication became truly sophisticated. Think about it. The rapid spread of standardized tool-making techniques suggests complex information transfer. The evidence of long-distance trade networks implies negotiation and abstract reasoning. The burial practices of Neanderthals indicate symbolic thinking. Most tellingly, the genetic bottleneck had created exactly the conditions under which complex language would be most advantageous. Small, scattered populations trying to maintain connections across enormous distances. Groups that desperately needed to share detailed information about resources, dangers, and opportunities. Individuals whose very survival depended on their ability to learn complex skills quickly and teach them to their children. Under these conditions, any improvement in communication ability would provide massive survival advantages. Individuals who could speak more clearly, understand more precisely, or convey complicated information more effectively would be far more likely to survive and reproduce. Over hundreds of generations, this relentless selection pressure would refine human communication abilities far beyond anything seen in any other species. When cousins met again. By the time the three human species encountered each other again, modern humans meeting Neanderthals in the Middle East, Denisovans encountering both groups across Asia, they would have been capable of sophisticated verbal communication. They could share knowledge, negotiate alliances, maybe even tell stories about their distant ancestors who had survived the Great Dying 900,000 years before. But they were also starting to face new challenges. The world was filling up again. Resources that had been abundant during the recovery period were now becoming hotly contested, and the three human species were beginning to compete directly for the same territories and the same vital resources. The age of cooperation was ending. The age of competition was about to begin. The meeting that changed everything. Then came the encounter that would decide the fate of humanity. 60,000 years ago, the descendants of those African survivors finally left their home continent. Not all of them, just a small group. Maybe a few hundred individuals who decided to cross the narrow waters between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. They had absolutely no idea they were about to encounter their long-lost cousins. For over 400,000 years, the three human species had been evolving in isolation. Modern humans in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia. Each had become perfectly adapted to their own unique environments. Each had developed their own technologies, their own cultures, their own specialized ways of surviving. Now they were about to meet face to face. First contact. The first encounter probably happened somewhere in the Middle East, maybe along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, where African migrants would have bumped into the southern edge of Neanderthal territory. Imagine that moment. You're a modern human, part of a small band exploring unfamiliar lands. Your people have never seen other humans who look different from you. Then suddenly, you spot them across a valley. They're human, but not quite. Shorter and stockier than your people. Faces that project forward with massive brow ridges and enormous nasal openings. Bodies built like wrestlers, all dense muscle and thick bone. Neanderthals. Your first instinct might be fear, or curiosity, or aggression. We'll never know what those initial meetings were truly like, but we know what happened next, because it's written in our DNA. They didn't just fight, they loved. They interbred. Modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just clash violently over territory. They formed relationships. They had children together. Genetic analysis shows multiple episodes of interbreeding spanning thousands of years. Today, everyone of non-African descent carries roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA. That's the genetic signature of those ancient encounters. Proof that when our species met, at least sometimes, they chose cooperation over conflict. But cooperation has its limits. A revolving door between species. The Middle East during this period was like a revolving door between species. The climate would shift, and modern humans would expand northward. The climate would shift again, and Neanderthals would push back south. For tens of thousands of years, the region changed hands repeatedly. Sometimes modern humans controlled the best hunting grounds. Sometimes Neanderthals did. Neither could establish permanent dominance. Not until something fundamentally changed the rules of the game. The game-changing innovation. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans developed what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Toolkit. A revolutionary set of technologies that made them far more effective hunters and gatherers. Sophisticated spear throwers that could launch projectiles with deadly accuracy from a safe distance. Bone needles that allowed them to create fitted, insulated clothing for surviving harsh cold. Fish hooks and nets that opened up entirely new aquatic food sources. Rivers and coastlines suddenly became productive hunting grounds. Most importantly, they developed systematic blade production techniques, methods for creating long, razor-sharp cutting edges from surprisingly small amounts of raw stone. These weren't just marginally better tools. They were force multipliers, technologies that allowed smaller groups of humans to accomplish what had previously required much larger groups, the efficiency revolution. Think about the math here. A Neanderthal hunting party might need 20 skilled hunters to successfully take down a mammoth. A modern human group armed with spear throwers and coordinated tactics they could do it with 8. This efficiency advantage compounded over time. Modern humans could control larger territories with smaller populations. They could survive in challenging environments that would push even the physically tougher Neanderthals to their limits. They could expand into new regions faster and establish permanent settlements more easily. The Neanderthals, who had survived the brutal Ice Age through sheer physical toughness and tight-knit cooperation, suddenly found themselves outcompeted by a more technologically advanced species. But they didn't go quietly. The evidence of conflict archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing violence between human groups. Neanderthal sites contain more weapons. Modern human sites show signs of fortification. Skeletal remains bear the unmistakable marks of violent interpersonal conflict. This wasn't genocide. It was competition for identical resources by two species that were just similar enough to want exactly the same things: water sources, prime hunting grounds, protected shelter sites, high-quality raw materials for making tools. And increasingly, the modern humans were winning, not because they were physically stronger. Neanderthals were superior in almost every measure of raw power, not because they were inherently smarter. Neanderthal brains were actually larger on average. They won because they were more flexible. The fatal flaw of perfection. Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting specific survival strategies for Ice Age Europe. They were incredibly good at what they did, but what they did was highly specialized. Modern humans, products of Africa's chaotic recovery period, had been naturally selected for adaptability. They could change tactics quickly when circumstances shifted. They could exploit new food sources others ignored. They could modify their tools and techniques to handle unfamiliar challenges. When the climate changed, and it changed constantly during this period, modern humans adapted on the fly. Neanderthals, locked into successful but rigid survival strategies, struggled. The slow retreat. Slowly but steadily, Neanderthal populations began to shrink. First, they lost the prime territories, river valleys, coastal areas, the most productive hunting grounds. Then they were gradually pushed into more marginal regions, mountain valleys, northern forests, areas that modern humans didn't particularly want yet. By 28,000 years ago, the last Neanderthals were living in southern Spain and Gibraltar, isolated populations clinging to existence in refuges that were shrinking every year. Then they were gone. The Eastern story, Denisovans. The story in Asia unfolded differently but followed eerily similar patterns. Modern humans encountered Denisovans sometime around 50,000 years ago. We know far less about these meetings because Denisovan fossils are incredibly rare. Most of what we understand comes from genetic analysis. But the DNA tells a clear story. Like with Neanderthals, there was interbreeding. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan genetic variants. Some Pacific Islander populations have as much as 6% Denisovan ancestry, 3 times higher than typical Neanderthal contributions. Unlike the European situation, there seems to have been less direct competition between modern humans and Denisovans in Asia. The continent was vast enough that different groups could occupy different ecological niches for much longer periods. Denisovans who had adapted to extreme high altitudes continued living in the mountains. Those who had become seafaring specialists maintained control of island chains. Modern humans initially occupied different regions, river valleys, coastal plains, areas that complemented rather than directly competed with Denisovan territories. But eventually, the same technological and demographic pressures that had eliminated Neanderthals began affecting Denisovans too. The inevitable outcome. Modern humans were simply more efficient at exploiting resources. They could support larger populations in the same territories. They could expand faster and establish new settlements more easily one by one. Denisovan populations were absorbed, outcompeted, or displaced. Some may have survived until surprisingly recently. There's tantalizing genetic evidence suggesting modern humans encountered Denisovans in Southeast Asia as late as 25,000 years ago. But eventually, they too disappeared as distinct populations. By 20,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, modern humans, were the only human species left on Earth. The descendants of those 280 bottleneck survivors had outlasted their evolutionary cousins who had also descended from that same tiny ancestral population. The three-way split that had begun 800,000 years earlier was over. Why did we win? So why did modern humans succeed where Neanderthals and Denisovans ultimately failed? The answer brings us back to the bottleneck. Those 117,000 years of near extinction had naturally selected for very specific traits in all three species: intelligence, cooperation, technological innovation, adaptability. But the African population, the ancestors of modern humans, had faced one additional challenge that their European and Asian cousins had largely avoided. Africa had remained climatically unstable even after the worst of the crisis ended. While Neanderthals adapted to the relatively predictable patterns of Ice Age Europe, and Denisovans specialized for specific Asian environments, modern humans had to keep constantly adapting to unpredictable, shifting conditions. Droughts lasting decades followed by sudden periods of flooding seasonal patterns that shifted every few generations, animal populations that appeared and disappeared without warning. This ongoing environmental pressure had kept modern humans evolutionarily flexible in ways that extreme specialization had not. Finely tuned versus all-terrain. When the three species finally encountered each other, Neanderthals and Denisovans were like finely tuned racing cars, incredibly efficient under the right conditions, but difficult to modify for new challenges. Modern humans were more like all-terrain vehicles, not as perfectly optimized for any single environment, but capable of handling whatever came next. This flexibility showed up in multiple crucial ways. Technology. Modern humans innovated constantly, developing new tools and techniques every few thousand years. Neanderthals, they used essentially the same stone tool technology for over 200,000 years. It worked well, so they stuck with it. Social organization. Modern humans formed larger, more complex social networks. They could mobilize more people for major hunts or territorial conflicts. They developed trade relationships that moved critical resources across hundreds of miles. Demographics. Modern human populations could grow faster and recover more quickly from setbacks. When disease or climate disasters reduced a group's numbers, they bounced back within a few generations. Diet. Modern humans became extreme dietary generalists, eating everything from shellfish to mammoth meat to carefully processed plant foods. Neanderthals remained primarily focused on large game hunting, effective when it worked, but dangerously vulnerable when climate changes affected prey populations. The communication advantage. But perhaps most importantly, modern humans had developed more sophisticated communication abilities. The genetic bottleneck had created intense selection pressure for complex language in all three species. But modern humans, dealing with more variable environments and larger, more distributed social networks, had pushed verbal communication the furthest. They could coordinate large group activities more effectively. They could share complex technical knowledge more accurately. They could maintain relationships across greater distances and longer time periods. When modern humans encountered Neanderthal or Denisovan groups, they weren't just competing for resources. They were competing with a communication and organizational advantage that had been 400,000 years in the making. It wasn't a fair fight. Total planetary dominance. By 15,000 years ago, modern humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They had developed agriculture permanent settlements, complex societies with specialized roles and hierarchies. The population that had once numbered only 1,280 desperate individuals now included millions of people speaking hundreds of distinct languages. They had inherited all the survival skills that had carried their ancestors through the bottleneck. But they had also developed something new, something their evolutionary cousins had never quite achieved: the ability to not just adapt to their environment, but to reshape it entirely. The age of human dominance had begun, and it all traced back to those desperate millennia when survival hung by the thinnest possible thread. when somehow impossibly 1,980 individuals refused to give up. 8 billion and counting. So here we are, 8 billion humans. Everywhere you look, Tokyo holds 14 million people in its sprawling metro area. Lagos has over 15 million. New York, London, Mumbai, São Paulo, cities so massive they can be seen from space, glowing like galaxies against the dark earth. We've built the internet, connecting every corner of the planet. We've mapped the entire human genome. We've sent robots roving across Mars and launched telescopes to peer at the edge of the universe. We've created art that moves people to tears and music that makes complete strangers dance together in joy. We are the most successful species in the entire history of life on Earth. And every single one of us, every person reading this right now, every child being born at this very moment, every human who has ever lived, carries the genetic signature of those 1,280 individuals who refused to give up 900,000 years ago, written in your DNA. That's the part that truly stops you cold when you really think about it. Your DNA contains sequences that survived the worst climate disaster our lineage ever faced. Genes that were tested by 117,000 years of near extinction and came through intact. Chromosomes that fused under impossible pressure and somehow made us stronger. The way your brain works, the way you solve problems, the way you cooperate with total strangers, the way you learn language, the way you instinctively care for your children, all of it was shaped by those desperate millennia when survival required every possible advantage. You are walking, breathing proof that sometimes, against all odds, life finds a way. Why we are the way. We are. But this discovery means far more than just a fascinating origin story. It explains so much about why humans are the way we are. Ever wonder why we're so much better at cooperation than other primates? Why we can work together in groups of hundreds or even thousands, while chimpanzees max out at maybe 50 individuals? It's because our ancestors spent over 100,000 years in populations so small that cooperation was not just useful. It was the only way anyone survived. Individuals who couldn't get along with others died. Individuals who could share, teach, and work together lived long enough to pass on their genes. For 4,000 generations, natural selection was fine-tuning our capacity for collaboration. Ever wonder why humans are so obsessed with teaching? Why we spend years of our lives just showing children how to do things that other animals learn through simple trial and error? It's because during the bottleneck, losing knowledge when someone died could doom the entire group. Our ancestors, who were best at transferring information to the next generation, had better survival odds. Over millennia, this created the teaching instinct that allows human societies to accumulate knowledge across generations. We didn't just survive the bottleneck. We became addicted to learning and sharing what we learned. Ever wonder why we're so incredibly good with tools? Why humans can use everything from primitive stone hammers to sophisticated smartphones, while even intelligent animals like dolphins only use tools in very limited ways? It's because tool making and tool use were literally life or death skills during the crisis years. Individuals who could innovate, who could figure out better ways to get food, make fire, or build shelter, were far more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. We evolved into a species that sees the entire world as raw materials for solving problems. Our weaknesses tell the story too, but the bottleneck also explains some of our vulnerabilities. Ever wonder why humans are so susceptible to infectious diseases compared to other mammals? Why we get knocked flat by viruses that barely affect other primates? It's because we lost 65% of our genetic diversity during the bottleneck. That includes countless immune system variants that might have protected us from certain pathogens. We're all much more genetically similar than we should be for a species our size, which makes us vulnerable to diseases that can exploit common genetic weaknesses. Ever wonder why genetic disorders like sickle cell anemia or Huntington's disease persist in human populations when natural selection should have eliminated them? It's because some of these disorders might have actually provided advantages during the bottleneck period. Or they might be unavoidable side effects of other traits that were heavily selected for during the crisis. When you're down to just 1,280 individuals, genetic quirks that would normally disappear can get permanently locked into the entire species. We carry the scars of near extinction as well as the strengths. We are all family. But perhaps the most profound implication is what this discovery tells us about human unity. Right now in 2025, there are still people who think racial differences between humans are meaningful in some biological sense. People who believe that populations that look different or speak different languages are fundamentally different types of humans. The bottleneck discovery obliterates that thinking completely. Everyone on Earth, literally everyone, descends from the same group of 1,280 individuals who lived 900,000 years ago. We've only been geographically separated for a few tens of thousands of years, which is nothing in evolutionary terms. The genetic differences between any two human populations are smaller than the differences you'd find within a single population of chimpanzees. We are all cousins. Recent cousins. When humans migrated out of Africa 60,000 years ago and spread around the world, they carried bottleneck DNA to every continent. When they developed different skin colors and facial features to adapt to new climates, they were simply expressing different combinations of the same underlying genetic toolkit. The Aboriginal Australians who reached their continent 50,000 years ago, the Europeans whose ancestors survived the Ice Age, the Polynesians who navigated across the vast Pacific using stick charts and star maps, the Native Americans who crossed into the Americas during the last glacial period, all carrying genes from those 1,280 survivors, all products of the same evolutionary crucible. There is no them. There's only us, and us has always been one family, shaped by the same history of survival against impossible odds. What this means for our future. This has serious implications for how we think about modern challenges too. Take climate change. For instance, right now, we're facing another period of rapid environmental transformation, not as severe as what our ancestors endured 900,000 years ago, but serious enough to threaten human civilization as we know it. The bottleneck discovery suggests we have reason for both concern and hope. Concern, because past climate disasters have brought human populations to the very brink of extinction. We're not invulnerable. We're not guaranteed to survive just because we're clever. But hope, because we carry the genetic legacy of the ultimate survivors. The ancestors who made it through the bottleneck weren't just lucky. They were adaptable, innovative, cooperative. They were willing to completely change their way of life when circumstances demanded it. Those traits are still in us. The same flexibility that let our ancestors survive the transition from forest to savanna to desert. The same cooperation that held tiny populations together through millennia of crisis. The same problem-solving ability that developed new technologies when old approaches stopped working. We are not the same species that entered the bottleneck 9 to 30,000 years ago. We are the species that emerged from it, tested, refined, proven capable of surviving conditions that would kill almost any other large mammal on the planet. Survival is never guaranteed. But survival isn't guaranteed, it never was. The researchers who discovered the bottleneck, Wang Zhuhu, Yi-Sun Pan, Haipeng Li, and their teams, they've given us more than just an amazing scientific discovery. They've given us a mirror. When we look at the genetic evidence of those 117,000 years of near extinction, we're not just learning about the distant past, we're learning about ourselves. We are the species that doesn't give up. The species that finds ways to survive when survival seems impossible. The species that comes through disasters stronger and more capable than before. But we're also the species that can lose 99% of our population and spend over 100,000 years hanging on by our fingernails before things finally get better. The bottleneck is both a warning and a promise. A warning that human success is never guaranteed, that we've come closer to total extinction than most people ever imagine, that our current dominance of the planet is not the inevitable result of being some chosen species, but the hard-won achievement of ancestors who survived conditions that killed almost everything else. A promise. And a promise that we carry within our genes the capacity to survive almost anything. That we are descended from 1,280 individuals who looked at a world falling apart around them and decided to keep going anyway. Every time you solve a problem, you're using skills refined during the bottleneck. Every time you cooperate with strangers, you're expressing behavioral patterns that kept small groups alive for millennia. Every time you teach a child something new, you're participating in the knowledge-sharing traditions that carried crucial information across 4,000 generations of crisis. The 1,080 live on in us, not metaphorically, literally, in our chromosomes, our neural patterns, our capacity for resilience. The story continues. 900,000 years ago, it looked like the human story was ending. The climate had turned brutally hostile. Most populations had died out. A tiny group of survivors faced a world that seemed determined to kill them. They survived. They adapted, they multiplied, they spread across the planet, and they became us today. There are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We've built cities that house millions, technologies that connect billions. Art and music and literature that capture the full, beautiful range of human experience. We are the descendants of the 480. We are living proof that sometimes, when everything goes horribly wrong, a few determined individuals can be tough enough, smart enough, and cooperative enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again. And if our ancestors could survive that, we can survive anything.